AFR Talk. You're listening to Focal Point with Brian Fisher.
Video segments of today's program will be posted at afr.net and on the Focal Point Facebook page. You'll also find the best collection of Brian's resources on our Facebook page. If you're on Twitter, you can be among the first every morning to find out what the day's show will be about. Just follow Brian at Brian J. Fisher.
Brian J. Fisher.
Hi, and welcome back to Focal Point AFR Talk. Brian Fisher is my name. The program is Focal Point. The network is AFR Talk, the American Family Radio Talk Network. Movement now afoot, led by Ted Cruz, to encourage Senate Republicans to filibuster the House bill that was voted on last Thursday and keep it from going to the Senate floor for a vote, because Ted Cruz and those that want to defund Obamacare, they know that if this thing gets to the Senate floor, the Senate will vote to fund Obamacare because they have a majority of Democrats in the Senate. Now, with me to talk about some of the dynamics here is Andy McCarthy. Andy McCarthy, you may remember him from the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. He's the one that prosecuted those that were responsible for that attack, put the blind sheikh behind bars, an expert on the spread of Islam. And we've often had him on this program to talk about that. We have him on the program to talk about this Senate opposition to Obamacare. Andy McCarthy, columnist for National Review Online. Welcome to Focal Point with Brian Fisher.
Brian, great to be with you again. How are you?
Good. And Andy, I just was looking at the piece that you posted on National Review Online, I think this morning, on the colorful history of Senate Republicans when it comes to voting to defund Obamacare. And I was really intrigued by the thesis that you spun here, because it was similar to what we observed over in the House. So talk to us about this kind of patchwork history of Senate Republicans and voting to defund Obamacare.
Well, Brian, as Byron York reported at the Washington Examiner yesterday, back in March, all of the Republicans in the Senate, every one of them, voted to defund Obamacare as part of the defense authorization bill. Now, it's an amendment that Senator Cruz proposed, and it lost, but it had not only unanimous Republican support, Cruz actually got 20 Republicans to sign on as co-sponsors of the legislation, including some of the Republicans who are now saying it's the stupidest idea in the history of ideas. So, and, you know, I think what people need to know, to think about with respect to that, is not only the fact that they took this different position only 6 months ago, but also the backdrop of this is that when Republicans had a significant electoral victory in the 2010 midterms, it was largely on a promise to repeal Obamacare and to fight it and to do whatever needed to be done to get it reversed. So that was what got voters to sweep them into power. And now, when there's an actual plan to affect the result of trying to at least not repeal Obamacare, but at least undo it in the current upcoming budget under circumstances where everybody, even supporters of Obamacare, agree that it's not ready for prime time. They seem to be scattering in the breeze.
Well, you know, we saw this on the House side, talking here with Andy McCarthy, National Review Online. We saw this on the House side, where they cast 40 to 42 votes to repeal Obamacare. But then when this vote came down the pike, this continuing resolution vote that would actually defund Obamacare, would actually bring it to a screeching halt, doesn't repeal it, but it stops it from being implemented, they got all wiggy. They kind of freaked out. They looked for some kind of excuses to avoid. And eventually they wound up voting to defund Obamacare. But I think that's because they heard from grassroots Americans that said, look, you've got to vote to stop this thing.
Yeah, exactly. It's the difference between, theater and something that has real bite. Or maybe even the difference between if you and I, before coming on the public airwaves, had a conversation, it'd be the difference between, some of the things that we might speculate when we were having a private conversation, and some of the things that we might assert at the point in time when we'd be accountable. And to make it more concrete, I think Republicans have been perfectly happy to cast votes against Obamacare when they know that those votes are inconsequential, meaningless, except for the fact that they can now go home to the constituents and say that, look at my record, I'm voting against Obamacare. But when something comes up where it's an actual consequential vote that has teeth in it and can actually do something to reverse this, that's when they seem to collapse.
I'm looking at your article, Andy, and again, for those of you that are on my Twitter feed, I sent out a link to this. Brian J. Fisher is the handle. Here's a quote from your piece: "The Republican establishment," and that kind of plays into something I've talked about, Andy. I believe we've got basically two Republican parties. You've got citizen class Republicans and you have ruling class Republicans or establishment Republicans. That's who you're talking about here. The Republican establishment resists President Obama and his agenda only when it knows that resistance is futile, token, and sure to be inconsequential, when it's good for a campaign commercial about how hard the GOP is working to undo Obamacare, not when it's actually about actually working hard to undo Obamacare. So the ruling class Republicans, the ones you're talking about in this, that Byron York talked about, that are now saying this is the dumbest idea they've ever heard, they only seem to be against funding Obamacare when their votes don't really count.
Right. Basically when it's a vote against Obamacare in the Republican-controlled House that they know will die a quiet death in the Senate, who would even know that they have voted to repeal Obamacare 40 times unless, somebody had sort of irped that out about a week ago. It's certainly not anything that's been done. I remember there was one big repeal vote at the beginning, which a lot of the establishment Republicans sort of regarded as, okay, we fulfilled our promise now to vote to repeal Obamacare. Now let's get back to funding it. They are big on these, sort of play-acting routines that don't amount to anything and that everybody knows won't amount to anything. What they don't like about the current effort is that it's an actual strategy to accomplish the end of defunding Obamacare, at least for a year. And what it relies on, and this is part of why I think the arguments against it are so specious, the opponents of it keep saying, look, we don't have the numbers for this. They control the White House. They control the Senate, blah, blah, blah. And what I try to remind my Republican friends is that, Guantanamo Bay, it's still open. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, he was never tried in New York. The Bush tax cuts, they got extended. When the American people are aroused and they get to see an issue clearly argued and the Republicans have or conservatives have the better of the argument, they can move decision makers to make decisions that maybe they don't want to make but feel politically that they have to make.
Now, let me ask you this question, because I agree with Ted Cruz that a vote for cloture is a vote for Obamacare. In other words, the only way to keep this thing from getting to the Senate floor and getting a Senate vote that funds Obamacare is to keep this thing from getting to the Senate floor. The only way to do that is filibuster it, and you need at least 41 votes to do that. If all the Republicans stick together like they did in March when they voted unanimously to defund Obamacare in that defense amendment that Ted Cruz brought forward, 20 co-sponsors. So it seems to me that that's the real litmus test vote. Will they vote for cloture, which is a vote for Obamacare, or will they vote against cloture, which then would be a vote essentially to defund Obamacare? Is that how you see it? Do you agree with Ted Cruz that a vote for cloture is a vote for Obamacare?
Yeah, I think Senator Cruz is right about that. And I've also, railed now and then over the years about these parliamentary procedures and the sort of disingenuous game that goes on there. A lot of times we've seen it particularly with judicial confirmations where the Republican establishment guys will say, yes, this nominee is just a terrible, terrible nominee, but we owe the president a vote on it, so we're going to vote to end cloture or invoke cloture so that we can get the thing to the floor. And then what they've basically done by doing that is assure that given the Democrats' numbers in the Senate, that the candidate, if the vote gets to the floor, will make it to the federal bench or to whatever federal employment the appointment they're up for. But what they do, people like Senator McCain, Senator Graham, they go back home and they tell the voters that they voted against the candidate when the final vote got to the floor. They don't mention that they also voted to invoke cloture, which guaranteed that the candidate would make it to the bench or to whatever appointment. So, they want to have it both ways. They want to vote in a way that's, that keeps everybody in the Beltway happy and keeps the gravy train rolling along. But they want to have on paper some votes that say we oppose this or oppose that, so they can go home and pretend that they're here fighting a good fight in Washington.
So it seems like this is they could be, but by voting for cloture, voting to end debate and have this thing voted on the Senate floor, that's the vote that really counts.
Right.
Because they know if it gets to the Senate floor, the Democrats will prevail. Obamacare will be funded, at least in the House version. That's still not going to resolve it because the House is going to have to react to that. But it would give them the opportunity then on the Senate floor to vote to defund Obamacare and go back home and talk about what a champion they were to defund Obamacare, when the real vote that would have actually stopped this thing or had a chance to stop it, they caved on it. So it seems to me they're trying to set themselves up for another show trial vote.
Yeah, and the problem with it is, Brian, let's be honest, you have a lot of people who are not political junkies who just are sort of going on with their everyday lives. They don't know nothing from nothing about parliamentary procedure or anything like that. When these guys go home and say, I voted against this or I voted against that, if that turns out to be technically true, they're not going to look under the hood to try to understand what that all means. But life is too short and people don't have the time for it. That's why this parliamentary trickery is really something that's in many ways reprehensible.
Our guest has been Andy McCarthy, former Assistant United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York. He led the 1995 terrorism prosecution case against Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman and 11 others. Written some great books on the threat of Islam. Talking here about the Senate GOP con job. The real vote is the vote to end the filibuster. Andy, thank you for taking time with us. Great column today. Appreciate you taking time to chat with us.
Thanks, Brian. Take care.
Andy McCarthy, columnist for National Review Online. And as Ted Cruz said, a vote for cloture is a vote for Obamacare. We'll take your calls, 888-589-8840, 888-589-8840. I'll identify the senators that need to be targeted when we come back out of the break. Thank you. Be with us. Be right back.